Hello, this is Melissa, and it is the 19th of March, 2023. And today we're going to hear from Giovanni and Adam, and they are going to talk a little bit about how Alan's work impacted their lives and their way of viewing the world. And I'll intersperse their talking with a little bit of Alan. I'm going to give you some of him doing a solo hosting of the Sweet Liberty radio show from February 14, 2006, and a blurb that he did April 17, 2007, entitled Common Cause and Coming Together. Giovanni talked a little bit about the kind of person that might be open to understanding Alan's work, and he described himself as clairvoyant and psychic. And he said you have to be a bit clairvoyant or psychic to understand Alan's work. And I've never thought of myself as either one of those things, but we have such associations with those words. Clairvoyant would be to perceive, seeing that which the senses cannot perceive. And I think that might be true, that sometimes Alan's work hits us in places in our mind and opens up places in our mind that have been closed off. And I remember that Alan several times gave the illustration that of if our minds worked differently or worked the way that they were made to work, then those kinds of things, he talked about children who would finish each other's sentences, or people who were close who would finish each other's sentences, or burst into the same song at the same time, the same moment. That kind of an example. And I have had a few of those things happen to me in my life, and it was just last week. I was talking to my brother. We were both distracted doing something else, and my brother loves factoids, trivia, if you will, but little factoids, and he's always learning and studying something. And he'll just randomly say, do you know what a such and such is? Or do you know what they call it? You know, and usually I'll go, no, I don't know that. But last week he said, what year did the women in Switzerland get the vote? And I said, 1971. And he looked at me in utter amazement and said, that's right. And I said, okay, that's just freaky. Okay, that's just freaky. And he said, oh, well, you must have studied that at some point. You must have learned that and then forgotten it. So immediately he set about to rationalize it. And I don't think I've ever studied Swiss history or the history of the suffragette movement. But I also don't have to leap onto that and say, oh, I'm clairvoyant or I'm psychic or, because one thing that Alan always talked about was just have the experience or have the understanding, but you don't need to classify it. You don't need to categorize it. You don't need to name it and then go off and start a school of thought around it. Just put it in a box of, that's unknown. That being said, just because I don't consider that I have that ability, I don't doubt for a moment that Giovanni possesses those abilities and can say that he does, because I've known plenty of people in my lifetime who have those gifts, and we are, as Alan pointed out in his talks, those gifts are accessible to children. Why not adults, Just something to ponder. But what has been on my mind this last week is time, because I have so little of it. And time often appears non-linear to me. I don't have a particularly good sense of time overall, and yet I have this kind of freakish ability to know exactly how much time I've spent on a project, or I'm kind of that person in the room that if somebody says, "What time is it?" and nobody's wearing a watch, I'm usually right within about 5 minutes. It's kind of weird, but there you go. But in spite of the fact that time often appears nonlinear to me, I can't wrap my head around a lot of concepts like time travel. Anytime I watched a movie that involved time travel with Alan, I'd be like, "Oh, explain that," and I just get lost in the concept of cause and effect. And it uses, I think, parts of the brain or understanding. I didn't study physics. I didn't study quantum physics. But I was thinking about time this week, and so I just looked into the idea of nonlinear time, and lo and behold, in the newspaper in the last week or two, there have been several articles, because I guess there's a new study in the field of quantum mechanics about the idea of retrocausality. So instead of the linear cause and effect, you do this now, and that affects the outcome in the future. With retrocausality in quantum mechanics theory, something in the future can affect something in the past. Well, that gets off again into time travel, and I don't get it. I was just doing a little bit of reading, and the bedtime reading that I hope will put me to sleep, and I was looking into a little of the Scottish philosopher David Hume. He was known for being a naturalist, I guess, in his philosophy. He said that all knowledge derives solely from experience. And I thought, well, that is interesting. I mean, that is interesting. It's worth further investigation, maybe. Alan knew, that people would want him to talk more about spirituality. And I think he may have said this on the air a time or two, but he certainly said it to me many times. He said, people want to hear about your experiences, but you cannot give someone else an experience. He said, I cannot give anyone my experiences. So if I told them what I've experienced and then how I have put together a belief or a meaning out of that, it would mean nothing to them. And I think that is true. I have had experiences. I have awkwardly tried to share some experiences with other people, but the rationalizing always sets in. Well, it could be just a deep place in your psyche, and then it manifested in this way, and so I prefer as well to keep my experiences to myself, because they have meaning to me, and sometimes they have very deep meaning. But I think the point that Alan was making was an excellent point. I think he would, if we never had the conversation about David Hume and whether or not all knowledge derives solely from experience. But I'm going to posit a guess that Alan would have agreed with that to a certain extent, because I think that Alan would have talked about experiences that other people cannot fathom or understand, or that might not be measurable, again, as Giovanni was talking about, by the senses. I know a lot of people want what they might call a spiritual experience. They seek that in different ways, different methods, whether it's a traditional religion or meditation or yoga. I have a friend who was telling me that maybe 3 years ago or so, she and her husband had gone out of the country somewhere, maybe Mexico, I'm not sure, but they had gone for the express purpose of taking ayahuasca. And she said it was an amazing experience. We saw God. And then, just this last year, they went somewhere else for the express purpose of taking peyote. And she said, well, it was just like a bad drug trip. There was nothing to it. It was nothing like the ayahuasca. We just really wanted to have that God experience, but it just didn't do it. And I didn't say anything. What I was thinking to myself was, if you saw God when you were taking ayahuasca, that would have changed everything radically in your world. It would have turned your world upside down. You wouldn't need to repeat the experience, I wouldn't think. So my opinion about those kinds of pursuits is it's like an experience. It's not an experience. It's like an experience. Because an experience that you experience fundamentally changes you. After Alan passed away, a few weeks after that, I started to reread the Cutting Through books for the first time in a long time, because we were always too busy for me just to have that pastime. And I got to the 5th page of the first volume of the Cutting Through books, and he said, underlined this first sentence, "This is not a rehearsal. This is the final phase of humanity as we know it. Sound shocking? Then go back to your television," or as he wrote it, "te Levi Sion," and continue your programming. Your faith in the system creates your fate. Those who have no aversion to thinking, persevere, and you will be rewarded. By symbols, said Thomas Carlyle in Sartor Resartus, is man guided and commanded, made happy, made wretched. He everywhere finds himself surrounded with symbols, recognized as such or not recognized. And I was so taken aback when I read that. I had even put a yellow highlighter to part of that paragraph many, many years ago. I had put a little star right in front of "This is the final phase." So it had leapt out at me before, but not in a way that I could really process, I guess. Because what I thought was, oh my, he wrote this book in 1999. In 1999, he said, this is the final phase of humanity as we know it. And I just found that astonishing. I have a friend who is Catholic, and sometimes when they're somewhat awake to what is going on in the world, and I think that they have been exploring things since 9/11, and certainly these last several years they've gotten a little deeper into it, but they return to a certain, I don't want to call it a default position, but they return to a certain way of viewing the world. And if I get too impassioned with what I'm saying about what's going on or what is, they'll give me the last line of the Gloria Patri, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. But when I reread Alan's books, following so quickly after he passed away, I began to ponder, perhaps for the first time in my life, with mortality really on my mind, consider that time might have an ending. We know that we have an ending, at least in this form, in this place, the middle plane, as Alan called it. And then Adam talked about the way that Alan's work affected him, and he said he particularly misses the historical context and analysis that Alan gave week in and week out. That we came to depend on that, and I did, just as all of you, I too depended on him to do my thinking for me. No, I did depend on that analysis, and it was just such a reality check week in and week out to say, oh, okay, yeah, that's the way that's it. And I will say this about Alan and thinking. He was always telling us to think for ourselves. And he was often showing us how to think. It's in his talks. It's subtle, but it's there. It's in his books. He would say to people, these are written in a non-linear fashion to encourage you to think non-linearly. So he was telling us to think and telling us how to think. But the one beautiful thing about Alan was he never told us what to think. He was a freedom-loving man, and so we were left to think for ourselves what we wanted to think. But I too miss that historical context week in and week out, and the perspective that he gave us, rise above, see from a different perspective. And Adam has a different way of describing the process of how you might get a different vantage point when you're looking at things, and I quite like the way that he put that across. Well, I think the last thing, I was reading through the Cutting Through books, as I often do, looking for inspiration or something that I want to share. And in the third volume, he's talking about how ancient the system is of empire building and the conscious decision by the empire builders when it's time to destroy an empire and rebuild anew somewhere. And he said a world state is achieved by the cohesion of things below with the intellect as the manipulating force. The individual is remade into the image of a man-made, scientifically efficient organism. Individual energies are surrendered to energies more powerful than themselves. The more dominant the state, the more the will of the individual is made incapable of effort, or even the desire for effort. We lose that diamond hardness which can only be maintained by continuous effort, never relaxed for a single instant. The price of this capitulation of the spirit, this creeping cancer of the soul, is stagnation, dehumanization, and the willingness to be a fractional element in a vast, complex, mechanical entity, rather than a complete being in our own unique human ambiance. And he goes on in that section to describe how this passivity is engendered in us. But I love that line there, again, something that I had underlined years ago. I was very struck by it. We lose that diamond hardness which can only be maintained by continuous effort, never relaxed for a single instant. And when I reread that last night, I thought, oh, yes, that was Alan. Diamond hard, continuous effort, never relaxed for a single instant. That doesn't mean he didn't laugh or walk the dog or have a pleasant pastime, watch a silly movie. But he was diamond hard in his pursuit of truth, and he never capitulated in spirit. And I love all of the lessons that he gave us, and I love to share them with you because I have a different sense about time now. And it's been 2 years, and I don't think that that will subside. I don't see it receding. I don't see myself settling into a more mundane, relaxed, normal, average life. I still feel that fire, that urgency to share. So enjoy everything that follows.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name's Giovanni Pacini. On the internet, I go by Gypsy Fox. And I was asked by Melissa if I could do a little 5 to 10 minute blurb on the impact Alan Watt had on my life. And I just want to say I'm honored to have been asked to do this. And I'm honored that Melissa knows who I am and knows, that Alan had such a profound impact on my life that, they know who I am. I communicated with them via email. I talked to Melissa on the phone, and I was very happy and surprised. I thought he was all alone in that little cabin up there in Canada. And when he passed away, I was heartbroken because I thought he was alone when he passed. And then this lady, Melissa, came out of nowhere, and turns out Alan had a right-hand woman. And what a cool lady. And so she asked me to do a little blurb on the impact Alan Watt had on my life. I could go on for hours about Alan and just how special and lucky and blessed I am to have found him. But I don't want to make this too long. So the impact Alan had on my life, I was like Alan. Alan would say he was born awake, and I'm the same way. I had a really rough life growing up, and that's kind of what woke me up. I started to deal with a lot of evil things that this world had to offer, and that kind of woke me up. And I've always been very intuitive and clairvoyant and psychic, and so I was able to take all my life experiences that were basically evil, because of the system that we live under, and intuitively, figure things out. And but I never had the who, what, when, where, and why, And so I kind of accidentally found Alan, and I started to listen to his blurbs on cuttingthroughthematrix.com every Sunday. I was just like, oh wow, this is pretty important. What this guy's talking about is he's putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. And I was just like, this is unbelievable. Like, this is a blessing. I started off with Bill Cooper, and I learned a lot from him. But when I found Alan, I was just like, oh, wow. This answers everything. This makes sense. Now I understand. And so I started to go through his website, and I'm like, whoa, this guy's got all kinds of talks, And I just started to do truck driving. This was probably 4 years ago. And I literally spent a year straight listening to the Alan Watt blurbs while I was doing trucking. And I would drive 11 hours a day, and I would literally listen to Alan Watt blurbs every single day for a year. And I think I listened to every talk he had ever done 2 or 3 times in that year. I couldn't get enough of it, I was like this Alan Watt encyclopedia. And I just had a connection with him because I knew everything he was talking about, but like I said, I didn't know the history, I didn't know the background, I didn't know the dates, I didn't know, that this is like everything in the whole world and everything that's going on is, it's all interconnected and everybody's related, and, you know, that this evil agenda has been going on for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, or even maybe millions of years, you know. And Alan's, you know, given all this information and, you know, historical facts and the books he would read, and I was just blown away by it. But I realized that the information he was giving me was life-saving. And Alan would say, you know, what we're coming into, you know, it's, he would say that he would say everything that, when everything starts happening that he knows is getting ready to start happening, like the AI and the brain chips and the forced vaccinations and just all the crazy stuff that we're living through, he said the hardest thing will be to keep your sanity, you know, because it's going to be an insane asylum when this thing starts to unfold. And, you know, we're probably going to be going